Let's talk about the previous Prime Minister of the occupation and his horrible ending. His name is Ariel Sharon. Born in 1928, he's a very well-known war criminal. He took part in several massacres, including the 1953 massacre. He was found personally responsible for the Sabra and Shatila massacres of Palestinian refugees. Please Google it. He was also known as the Butcher of Beirut. He was forced to quit as a defense minister in 1982, and he was elected prime minister in 2001. So in 2006, he had a massive stroke that put him in a coma for 8 years. Doctors said that he was in a state of minimal consciousness, as he can feel pain and can hear those around him without responding to them. In 2014, his skin started to rot, as well as his intestines, and his intestines and organs were removed one by one without him being sedated until he died in 2014.
Sharon suffered his first mild ischemic stroke on December 18, 2005, and was given a blood thinner as treatment. In 2006, he suffered a second major hemorrhagic stroke and has remained in a coma since. A year ago, specialists said Sharon responded to pictures of his family by showing significant brain activity in an MRI scan. However, his health has been worsening since last Wednesday due to serious kidney problems after undergoing surgery. Several vital organs are also now failing.
Israel has been paying homage to the country's former Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, who died over the weekend, 8 years after suffering a massive stroke that left him lingering in a coma until his death. Sharon was a controversial figure, to say the least, considered in many parts of the world as a murderer and war criminal. He was eulogized at his funeral as a peacemaker. Israeli President Shimon Peres described him as the shoulder that supported Israeli security.
Shalom, Ka'ala Yahweh Bashim Yashai, Bashim Rukakodash, Brakathe Yahweh, Brakathe Washai, Brakathe Yahweh, Brakathe Washai, Brakathe Yahweh, Brakathe Washai, Bahashim Rukakodash. Double honors my teachers, the apostles and elders of Great Millstone. Peace and mercy to the elect, with the house of David reborn again in this generations. And shalom to the 130 Yasharallah, who today are known as the Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, who before losing our true heritage, we were known as, and still are, the true Hebrew Israelites of the Holy Bible. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the similarities between this man who we just watched the video of, called Ariel Sharon, also known as Eric Sharon, and the biblical villain Antiochus Epiphanes, right, from the book of the Maccabees. But before we get into that, let's read this. This is Galatians 6 and 7. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. And that's ultimately what this man, Ariel Sharon, has reaped, right? He reaped that injustice and all those plagues that he ended up dying with, right? For 8 years, he was in a coma, in a vegetative-like state. And as you've seen in the video, right, they said this man was basically rotting from the inside, and they had to ultimately remove organs up until his death. Maybe if you see pictures of him with the president at the time of America, Bush Jr., you'll now understand who this man was, right? He basically was the Netanyahu of Israel during this time, okay? And this man here, he's a straight up Amalekite, okay? So both these men here are both Edomites, though the man here on your left, he is a higher Edomite, right? A higher ranked because of his nation, which he comes from, okay? The man here, Ariel Sharon, comes from the Edomites that descend out of the top tribe from Amalek, And Bush here, he descends from the Edomites known as the men of Teman, right? Their original name isn't Bush, but it's Schurf, right? It's a German name that they changed when they came over here. Now, ultimately, this man here, Ariel Sharon, the reason why I'm making this lesson is because when I watched that video, I knew this man had gone through a pretty bad end of life situation, but I didn't know it was this bad. I knew he was bedridden and he had been in a coma for a few years and then he eventually died. But it wasn't until I watched this video and I read a little bit about it that you just read a lot of horrible things that was happening to this man. Even there's claims that this guy had maggots growing in his eye sockets and stuff. But again, there's many stories that also dispute that fact and say that it was an actual cop that looked like this guy. But the point being is that this man here, he's an Edomite, and not only that, but he's the worst type of Edomite. Those of the nation of Amalek who have portrayed themselves as being the children of Judah, right? The children of Israel, which they are not, right? These are the adversaries of us Israelites. These are our enemies. And that being said, they've been given a time to rule by the Lord. So this is why they are in power now. But that being said, the Lord isn't doing these guys any favors on top of lifting them up to be in power. Okay, that's why the Lord has taken out fierce judgment on this guy, Ariel Sharon. And not only him, but a man who you could read about in the book of Maccabees called Antiochus, Epiphanes, who was a devil himself, right? We're going to read a little bit about him, but let's read this first. This is Ecclesiastes 1:9. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. And the reason I'm reading this is because when you see similarities, like people dying of similar type of diseases or being in the similar realm of power that people in the past used to be, and they do similar things. This guy Ariel Sharon, who was a devil, he did much damage to Jerusalem in attacking Gaza and the West Bank. And this isn't, to defend the Palestinians, because those people shouldn't even be there. They're Ishmaelites and they don't even belong in that land. But the point being is that this man Ariel Sharon, this Amalekite, has just been wicked upon the land, and he's been doing many awful things in that land. And just like this man here that we're going to read about, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was the son of King Antiochus III the Great. In the Bible they refer to him as Antiochus the King. We're going to read about this man here, Antiochus Epiphanes, who went on to be a thorn in the side of the southern kingdom when they were taken over by the so-called Greeks. That would be these people, okay? The new Edomites, the new Greeks, which were ultimately the Edomites that had taken over that society and were now continuing to conquer. Well, if you're unsure where this guy comes from, we have to first go to the image of Daniel in talking about the 5 empires that would come upon the face of the earth. When we zoom in, we ultimately see the first empire being the Babylonian Empire, second empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, and the third empire, the Grecian Empire. Okay, this would be the Edomites, okay, or at the time they were referred to as the Macedonians. And again, don't get it twisted, but the Edomites had even spread out even further than these Macedonians, but they were largely in the group and the nation known as Macedonia. That being said, after Alexander, who was given power by God to take over the world at this time, after he died, his 4 generals took control of the land and split it up. And that's what ultimately represents the spiritual animal that was seen here by Daniel, and the 4 wings that took part of this beast that represented the 4 generals, also basically their nations that they would control. Well, the man that this guy here, Antiochus Epiphanes comes from this man's lineage, Seleucus. His name would also be known as Seleucus the First Nicanor. He was the man who went on to take over, basically, let's take a look at the map of Iran, okay? Persepolis, Susa, Babylon, Seleucia, right? And ultimately, he would go on, and it would basically be him and the Ptolemies in Egypt who were fighting against. And Israel was right in this land. Basically, the Southern Kingdom brothers were left here in the middle between these two warring Edomite empires. And when we read about Maccabees, this is ultimately what we're reading about, are the wars going on between these two Edomite empires and how they involved the nation of Jerusalem, right, with the de facto leaders being the Maccabean family, or the Hasmonean families, right, the Maccabee brothers. Well, that being said, let's go and read a little bit about Antiochus Epiphanes, and we're going to read about ultimately his wickedness that he did in ruling over Jerusalem, and how the Lord placed judgment on this guy. So to get started, let's just read about him, okay? It says, 1 Maccabees 1:10. And there came out of them a wicked root, Antiochus, surname Epiphanes. Right? This is the man that we're going to focus on. That is this man right here, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the king. Right? Antiochus the king is this guy here. This is Antiochus III, the Great. Okay? Who had been an hostage at Rome, and he reigned in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. So again, when it says the Greeks, this isn't talking about necessarily the Greeks themselves, right? This is talking about, because you got to remember, the Macedonians, the Edomites, that was their going name at the time. They had taken over all the known world at that time, and they started to call themselves by different names, right? This is how the Edomites became known as the Egyptians, right, with the Ptolemies down in Egypt. The Seleucus and his family's lineage became known as the Persians, right, with the Seleucus Empire, and then so on and so on. Next, let's read this. This right here shows just one of the wicked things that Antiochus he did to the temple itself, right? Not only to the Israelite people, but to the temple. It says, this is 2 Maccabees 5:21. So when Antiochus had carried out of the temple 1,800 talents, he departed in all haste unto Antiochia, weening in his pride to make the land navigable and the sea passable by foot. Such was the haughtiness of his mind. So this devil, not only did he put like heavy trouble on our people, but he also robbed our temple. And again, you got to remember, back in these days, there were no such thing as banks. The only banks that were around that time was the temple. This is where you kept your money. You would keep it there for safekeeping, and you could go and take withdrawals. You could pay the priest. You could pay your tithes. You could do deals there at the temple, right? You could borrow money if you needed money for land management and or buying supplies, and then you'd pay it back without usury, right? Without no interest, as the law says. So all the money of Israel was for the most part in the temple, and these devils took that shit. Okay, and there's many other stories showing how the temple was basically robbed. Okay, well, in this case, Antiochus, he succeeded in robbing the Israelites and stealing from the temple and carrying out all these things that he should not even have touched. Well, eventually, this devil, he gets destroyed. And what we're going to do is before we read his judgment, we're going to read a quick surmising of Antiochus and just the things he did. And we're going to skip this entrance here that it says, Antiochus Epiphanes, the Bible's most notoriously forgotten villain, Okay, now we're going to skip this part that talks about Nero and the people that were around during the time of the Messiah. And we're just going to jump down through... Let's read this part, and I'll just read through it real quick. It says, "In the time between the return of the Jewish exiles and the rise of the Roman emperors, the land of Judea was caught between the two ruling powers, the Seleucid kingdom of Syria, also Iran and Persia, in the north, and the Ptolemaic Egypt in the south. These kingdoms, both successors of the Alexander the Great's broken empire, warred with each other for more than a century, while the Jewish nation sat at the crossroads. An account of these relations, seen through the lens of prophetic visions, can be found in Daniel 9. It says, "Throughout most of this period, Judea remained in the periphery of and was left alone." And the reason why it was left alone was because when Alexander the Great first came to Jerusalem, he met with the priest, and the Lord had given Alexander visions of the priest, which he then shared with the priests of the temple, to let him know that he had seen them in dreams. Well, our high priest showed him, Alexander the Great, where he was actually written about in our scriptures hundreds of years ago, and how he would go on to rule the world. Well, that set very well with Alexander, and he basically left us alone and let us, simply be who we were, and not to be messed with. Now that continued up until a few years later, after Alexander died and these devils took over. Well, the descendants of Seleucid decided to come down and start to tax the Jewish people, and then this is where you get about you hear about the horrible stories that are found in the book of Maccabees. Well, let's continue. However, when Antiochus IV came to power in 170 BC, the Jewish people did not readily fit into the vision he had for his new empire. Embracing a form of imperial colonialism, Antiochus sought to bring about a sense of cultural uniformity in the hope of creating more socioeconomic stability. This included embracing the Hellenistic way of life, right? The Greek way of life. This is how a lot of our people became Hellenist, right? Or Greeks. This is why during the time when the Messiah came onto the scene, he said that there's no difference between a Jew and a Greek, right? He wasn't talking about the Edomite Greeks. He was talking about the Israelites who had started to live as Greeks because they had been Hellenized. Continuing. This included embracing the Hellenistic ways of life and the worship of Greek pantheon, especially Zeus. By taking the epithet Epiphanes, God manifest, Antiochus even claimed to be Zeus incarnate. Many of the pagan nations embraced and welcomed these policies, but in the land of Judea, they caused a cultural civil war, notably amongst members of the high priestly families. In the midst of this turmoil, according to the book of Maccabees and the Jewish historian Josephus, Antiochus plundered the Jerusalem temple and carried off the sacred vessels to help finance his campaigns. Following stories of intrigue, bribery, and military coups amongst the Jewish ruling class that could rival any on television these days, Antiochus arrived in Jerusalem to find the people in an open state of revolt against him and each other. The chaos he found in Judea immediately followed a humiliating defeat in Egypt, and the ruler took out his frustrations on the Jewish people. Antiochus took control of the situation by slaying many innocents and brutally enforcing his cultural and religious policies on the population. A time of great tribulation occurred as traditional practices such as circumcisions were outlawed, sacred scriptures were burnt, and violators were brutally punished even unto death. Having already laid siege to the Temple Mount and destroyed many of its fortifications, Antiochus built a new fortress known as the Acrea, literally the cathedral, to consolidate his power over Jerusalem and strengthen his political agents. As a culmination, he proceeded to profane the temple of Yahweh by erecting idols within it, and even going so far as to sacrifice pigs upon the altar, presumably to Zeus. And let's just skip this next part because it's basically a bunch of Christian gibberish talking about how this guy was the Antichrist, which he was a Antichrist, but he wasn't the Antichrist. Continuing, he says, following these atrocities and abominations, Antiochus left his generals in charge of Judea as he went to fight wars in the east and against the Parthians. The Jews went on to revolt under the leadership of the Maccabees and throw off the yoke of the Seleucids, winning their political and religious freedom. The memory of this great event is celebrated by the Jewish people each year during Hanukkah. Meanwhile, the great villain Antiochus, Zeus incarnate himself, suffered a military defeat in the east, contracted an illness, and subsequently died. Soon after, the Seleucid kingdom crumbled as well. Like many megalomaniacs throughout history, Antiochus' legacy is one of a stain of memory rather than of great achievements. And this right here is ultimately the legacy that Ariel Sharon leaves, right? It's a legacy of a devil, okay, and the lies that he pushed through and the wickedness that he caused there in the land of Israel, trying to claim it for his Edomite brethren. Now, let's go on and let's read what the Lord did to Antiochus Epiphanes. This can be found in 2 Maccabees chapter 9. We're going to read the whole thing. It says, about that time came Antiochus with dishonor out of the country of Persia, for he had entered the city called Persepolis and went about to rob the temple and to hold the city, whereupon the multitude, running to defend themselves with their weapon, put them to flight. And so it happened that Antiochus, being put to flight of the inhabitants, returned with shame. Now, when he came to Epiphanes, news was brought him what had happened unto Nicanor and Timotheus. Then, swelling with anger, he thought to avenge upon the Jews the disgrace done unto him by those that made him flee. Therefore commanded he his chariot men to drive without ceasing and to dispatch the judgment of God now following him, for he had spoken proudly in this sort, that he would come to Jerusalem and make it a common burying place for the Jews. So at this point, Nicanor and Timotheus, for the most part, were outed, right, by the Maccabees and stuff, who had basically had continued a war against the ruling powers, okay, because they had profaned the temple, they had taken over. And in this case here, Antiochus, not only did he lose in Persepolis, which is a part in right here, Persepolis, but he heard how when he went over to Epiphanes, which is over here, I believe, it's like up in this area here, or it could be over here. It's north Persia. When he went there, he had heard how the Maccabean brothers and ultimately the Jews had revolted, okay, and ultimately he was pissed, and he ultimately, went over back to Jerusalem and basically brought the pain upon them, okay. So let's continue reading, because this guy here, he was out for vengeance, right? He was going to make all of Jerusalem basically a cemetery for the Jewish people. He was going to try to kill us all off. Well, the Lord had different plans for him. Let's continue. Verse 5. But the Lord Almighty, the power of Israel, smote him with an incurable and invisible plague. You see that? As soon as he had spoken these words, a pain of the bowels that was remediless came upon him, and sore torments of the inner parts, and that most justly, for he had tormented other men's bowels with many and strange torments. And this guy, Ariel Sharon, when you hear about just some of the things that he did and how he was involved in a lot of these wars, and they even refer to him as the Butcher of Beirut. This guy was known for his cruelty and his wickedness that he did upon the children of Ishmael. Okay, and I'm sure along with those Palestinians, as the apostles have said, that there still are a lot of Israelites dwelling amongst them. Right? we've seen videos of the Afro-Palestinians. A lot of those are Israelites, okay, that have stayed in that land throughout all the captivities that it has gone through. Now, just like this guy here, Antiochus Epiphanes, had done a lot of torments to other people, the Lord was paying Antiochus back for the things he had done in a way where it was ironic, because it was the same thing that this devil did to other people. Now, when you look at Ariel Sharon, look at how this guy went out. All right, so that makes you wonder if, is it not true that he caused a lot of innocents to die in ways where they were unable to speak to their family to say goodbye, and all the things that came upon Ariel in his last days, were they not fitting according to the things that he was accused of doing? Well, it's food for thought. Continuing, verse 7, howbeit he nothing at all ceased from his bragging, but still was filled with pride, breathing out fire in his rage against the Jews, and commanding to haste the journey. But it came to pass that he fell down from his chariot, carried violently, so that having a sore fall, all the members of his bodies were much pained. And thus he that a little afore thought he might command the waves of the sea, so proud was he beyond the condition of man, and weigh the high mountains in a balance, was now cast on the ground, and carried in an horse litter, showing forth unto all the manifest power of God. And this word here, horse litter, is basically a stretcher that's carried by horses, which you could see here, right? We've seen images like this where horses are carrying dead soldiers or people who have been injured off of trails. Here's one showing, a little carriage being carried, right? I know I've seen those ones where people are basically being dragged on the floor, kind of like this, or like this here, right? That's a popular version of this litter that a lot of us have seen. But this is how the Lord had brought Antiochus down, to where he was no longer able to ride, on top of a horse, but he was basically being carried on a stretcher by horses. Verse 9, so that the worms rose up out of the body of this wicked man, and while he lived in sorrow and pain, his flesh fell away, and the filthiness of his smell was noisome to all his army. And this part right here reminds me of what the video said about how Ariel Sharon's intestines started to rot, and how they had to ultimately remove them, right? And when your organs rot, you get the same smell as rotted meat. Okay, so this is where that term, or the notion that gangrene smells. Okay, and that's because ultimately that flesh that's on your bones starts to rot away. Okay, and if you don't cut that out, it could eventually lead to infections, and primarily infections of the blood, which Ariel Sharon died of, to show you proof that his ass was rotting from the inside, just like Antiochus Epiphanes was. Continuing, verse 10, and the man that thought a little afore he could reach the stars of heaven, no man could endure to carry for his intolerable stink. All right, and this is and we don't know what the state of Ariel Sharon was, because till this day nobody has released images of him in his deathbed. The only thing that they've done is they've released hilarious images like this of a wax model looking very well kept and dignified, but this devil looked nothing like this, right? It was more likely with his mouth gaping wide open, facial hair all overgrown, and just looking like a puddle of mash. So that goes to reason that if this man was in a vegetative state for 8 years and in a coma and had all these issues with his body, he had to have an intolerable stink to him, just like Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 11, Here, therefore, being plagued, he began to leave off his great pride and to come to the knowledge of himself by the scourge of God, his pain increasing every moment. And when he himself could not abide his own smell, he said these words, It is meet to be subject unto God, and that a man that is mortal should not proudly think of himself if he were God. The wicked person vowed also unto the Lord, who now no more would have mercy upon him, saying thus, that the holy city to the which he was going to haste to lay it even with the ground, and to make it a common burying place, he would set at liberty. And as touching the Jews, whom he had judged not worthy so much as to be buried, but to be cast out with their children, to be devoured of the fowls and the wild beasts, he would make them an all equal to the citizens of Athens. And the holy temple, which before he had spoiled, he would garnish with goodly gifts, and restore all the holy vessels with many more, and out of his own revenue defray the charges belonging to the sacrifices. Yea, and that also he would become a Jew himself, and go through all the world that was inhabited, and declare the power of God. But for all this his pains would not cease, for the just judgment of Yahweh was come upon him. Therefore, despairing of his health, he wrote unto the Jews the letter under writing, containing the form of a supplication after this manner. Antiochus, king and governor to the good Jews, his citizens, wisheth much joy, health, and prosperity. If ye and your children fare well, and your affairs be to your contentment, I give very great thanks to God, having my hopes in heaven. As for me, I was weak, or else I would have remembered kindly your honor and good returning out of Persia. And being taken with a grievous disease, I thought it necessary to care for the common safety of all, not disturbing mine health, but having great hope to escape the sickness. But considering that even my father, at that time, he led an army into the high countries, appointed a successor, to the end that if anything fell out of contrary to expectations, or if any tidings were brought that were grievous, they of the land, knowing to whom the state was left, might not be troubled. Again, considering how that the princes that are borderers and neighbors unto my kingdom wait for opportunities and expect what shall be the event, I have appointed my son Antiochus king, whom I often committed and commended unto many of you, when I went up into the high provinces, to whom I have written as followeth. Therefore I pray and request to you to remember the benefit that I have done unto you generally and in special, that every man will be still faithful to me and my son. For I am persuaded that he, understanding my mind, will favorably and graciously yield to your desires. Thus the murderer and the blasphemer, having suffered much grievously as he entreated other men, so died he a miserable death in a strange country in the mountains. And Philip, that was brought up with him, carried away his body, who also, fearing the son of Antiochus, went into Egypt to Ptolemais Philopater. So, there you go. You see, this is the story of Antiochus Epiphanes, who the Lord smited and brought on a horrible judgment, right? And it didn't matter that this guy here, Antiochus, tried to become a Jew himself, right? Or even went on to try to declare the Lord's laws to the world. No, the Lord didn't care about that. And why is that? Well, because you cannot convert to being a Jew. You cannot convert to being an Israelite. Because why? Well, because it matters which bloodline you're from, who your family is. And as we have seen, Antiochus Epiphanes comes from the Edomite bloodline, the bloodline that is hated of God. Just like the bloodline of Ariel, Sharon, he comes from the same stock and lineage as the rest of these Edomites. Okay, so it doesn't matter if he declares himself to be a Jewish person or an Israeli. He is not of the chosen line, right? He is an Edomite, and as such, the Lord has judged him just like how he judges the rest of the nations, right? So that being said, I just wanted to touch upon these two stories because, the funny thing is that, the Lord, he will do things like this, right? He'll bring on judgment onto a wicked person in the past, and then when that person comes back in the reincarnation down the road in latter history, the same or similar scenarios play out, right? They become a ruler. They're in the same power structure. They tend to fall for the same, downfall, be it being killed in a war, beheaded, or an invisible disease that takes them out. Okay, so that being said, just wanted to share these two parallel stories, and hopefully you were edified. So until the next time, I want to give all honor and glory and praises to Yahweh B'Hashem Yahshai B'Hashem Ruach HaKodesh. Shalom.